start our second hour together. Lord, we thank you again for this church, and we thank you for your word, and especially for the promises of what adding those things to faith will do, Father, and how it will usher us through a sure path to eternal joy. And Lord, help us together to encourage each other to do that, and help this second hour to be a part of that as well. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, all right. So, what world event was what happened last Sunday? Anybody remember what big world event happened last Sunday? Yeah, the Olympics. All right, good, Milton. So the Olympics closing ceremonies last Sunday. So as I was thinking about how to fill in for Pastor Frank, and I've shared this before when I was teaching on 1 Corinthians 11, that I had taught 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 before, because it was the Olympics. I guess if it's 2020, that might have been 2008 when I first taught that. I don't know. It was an Olympics year. And so the verse that caused me to think about that is 1 Corinthians 9. I'll read it. I've got it right here. Do you not know that all those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. And everyone who competes in the games, and that's probably not the Olympic Games. Paul was in Corinth. It was probably something called the Isthmian Games, but still a big games like those held in Olympia. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, or we might say a gold medal, but we an imperishable. So with the Olympics having just finished, I decided for these 2 weeks, this week and next, to teach from 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. So you'll remember maybe for when we talked about 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 is an entire section where Paul's answering a question from the Corinthians. Namely, what are we supposed to do about meat that was sacrificed in the temple or in a temple to idols? What should our interaction be with that food or those ceremonies? And you can go ahead and turn, if you haven't already, to 1 Corinthians 8. But I want to remind you, if you even turn back one chapter to verse 1 of chapter 7, you'll see Paul is systematically, through Corinthians, answering questions that the Corinthian church wrote to him. He says in chapter 7, verse 1, concerning the things about you which you wrote, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. So he talks about marriage in the beginning of chapter 7 throughout that. And then in verse 25 of that same chapter, now concerning virgins, which is really about betrothals and very similar topic to marriage. Chapter 8, verse 1, concerning things sacrificed to idols. And then go a few more chapters ahead to chapter 12 and look at verse 1 in chapter 12. They had written them as well about spiritual gifts. And he says, now concerning spiritual gifts. And he goes on in chapters 12 to 14 to talk about spiritual gifts. And then in chapter 16, verse 1, we'll say concerning the collection for the saints, so concerning giving. And then lastly, in chapter 16, verse 12, concerning Apollos. They had written and asked him about Apollos. So you can see he's just working his way, responding to a letter that they had written to them. And in our section, in chapter 8, he's responding to a question they had about food sacrificed to idols. Now, real quickly, just by way of review, because we did touch on chapters 8 through 10 when we talked about head coverings in chapter 11. But do you remember why we said 8 through 10, he's answering about meat sacrificed to idols, and in 12 to 14, he's answering questions about spiritual gifts? What was 11? Why did he start talking about traditions in 11, namely head coverings and the Lord's Supper? Do you remember? It's okay if you don't. That was a long time ago. We were in a driveway when we last talked about that. But if you look at chapter 11, in verse 16, Paul says, and this was a clue as to why Paul started talking about traditions in chapter 11. He says, if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, and nor have the churches of God. And we talked about tradition. Another word for tradition might be a custom or a practice or something, a habit. And that word practice is found earlier in 1 Corinthians, namely in 1 Corinthians 8, verse 7. So if you turn to 8, verse 7, as Paul is talking about food, sacrifice to idols, he says that some people are accustomed to the idol. It's their practice to think of it as really being sacrificed to an idol. And so we saw in Paul's mind, okay, that's why he started talking about traditions, because he's been talking about a practice, a custom of this temple sacrifice in Greek culture. And then as he's talking about practices or customs, he mentions two other apostolic customs or practices or traditions, namely head coverings and the Lord's Supper. So that was the connection, if you'll recall. And we talked about this. We didn't hit it at length because, again, we were talking about head coverings, but we talked about why that would have brought it to Paul's mind. And remember, food sacrifice to idols was a big deal to the early church. Like, we might think, why spend much time, if anything, maybe just a passing note about something like that? What is the deal with food sacrifice to idols? But it's 3 chapters here in 1 Corinthians. It's Romans 14. It's the message to the church at Pergamum in Revelation 2. It's Acts 15. It's one of the 3 things that Paul says, hey, I know you don't have to follow the law, but here are some things you do need to do. And he talks about food sacrifice to idols there. Why is that such a big deal? Why do they need to spend so much time talking about it when it's not something that's even on our radar? In fact, it seems as though it was something very touchy, very significant to the Corinthians. I mean, it took Paul 3 chapters to respond to this. And we'll see in chapter 8, verse 2, even the tense that he uses, the tense of the verb, where he says, if anyone supposes that he has come to know something. That's probably not what your translation says, but that tense even itself, it means it's sort of something has been settled in their mind about this that he's having to confront. And Paul's tone in chapter 9, a lot of commentators are like, man, what's behind this? What's underneath? Why is he so emphatic about this and very defensive? So it was a big issue. And again, why? Like, we don't think about, in our modern day, we think of idols as maybe something that's out on a remote island, right, where they're still bowing down to statues or something. It's just not the way we think. Like, I mean, part and parcel of us is separation of church and state, right? I mean, there's the religious is what we do here, but in our communities, it's very secular society. Well, that was not at all the case of Corinth. As bad as it was very religious. I mean, you remember Paul going to Athens, not far from Corinth. They have gods everywhere. In fact, they have a statue to the unknown God, right? I mean, just an extremely religious culture. Listen to this. I'll have a couple quotes. I read these when we talked about 1 Corinthians 11. I'm going to reread them now. This is a guy named Everett Ferguson in a book called Backgrounds of Early Christianity. He's talking about club life, right? We have club life in Atlanta and in America, right? Club life was just as highly developed among the Greeks as it is in modern American society. The earliest societies for which epigraphical records survive, that just means they're written down, were groups of sacrificing associates. So when you think about club life in Atlanta, they're not offering sacrifices, right? They're dancing, there's music. That's what club life is in America. Well, in Greek, the earliest records we have are of sacrificing associates. They were essentially religious in character, existing for the cult of some deity or some hero, and at first limited to citizens. Or here's another quote by Ferguson. Modern Western ideas that put religion in a separate category from government, society, and culture seriously mislead us. Religion was closely interwoven with society in the Greco-Roman world. It was official. It was part of the civil order. Each city had its patron deity or deities. Remember, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Remember them shouting that? Sacrifice and prayer accompanied meetings of the assembly and council. So you think about, I mean, it's kind of odd at Chick-fil-A. I have to talk to some new employees about this. We often start meetings with prayer. And I don't think that's normal in the corporate environment. But it is, and it's not normal in the corporate environment. Certainly not normal in the civic environment for you to have a sacrifice like that. There may be some towns remaining where there's a prayer. I think, did they have a prayer in our Fairburn City Council when we used to join? I feel like they did. Yeah. Anyways, so it's not, there may be vestiges here, but certainly not the norm. And priests and public cults were selected in the same way as the magistrates. They were voted. It was a part of society. Temples were built using public funds. Taxes were levied for the support of certain cults. And one more quote from a guy named Garland. The celebrations of many cults were closely bound up with civic and social life, since religion and politics were indivisible. If Christians took part in civic life, They were outside of the church, going to a governmental meeting. They were part of a guild for their work. If they were taking part in any life outside the church, they would have been expected to participate in a festival's sacrificial meals in some form or another. Individuals might also receive invitations to a banquet at a temple, since rooms could be rented out for private functions like church halls today. Extant papyrus invitations, that just means invitations written on papyrus that still exist today. That's what extant means. They beckon guests to attend banquets in a temple dining room commemorating a variety of rites of passage like weddings, childbirth, birthdays, coming of age parties like bar mitzvahs, election victories, and funerals. So it was just part and parcel to daily life that they would be expected, or they would be confronted with, do I participate in these ceremonies? I mean, they're sacrificing to false gods, to idols. Do I even eat the meat that was later sold in the local markets that came from there? What do I do? It was a big deal for them. And when we talked about head coverings, that it wasn't just the Jews who came out of significant culture and traditions when they came to Christ that were hard to shake. The law, 4,000 years delivered by angels, the core of their nation. And now you're saying, hey, we're not bound by that. That was hard for a Jew. Well, it wasn't just the Jew that had a hard time responding to, okay, things may be a little different now. They had significant cultural norms. And the question came up, how do we relate to those? How do we interact? Do we interact? And that's why there's so much ink spilled, and that's what these 3 chapters are for. I'm just going to go ahead and give you the summary for next week. Paul does it. He says in the end of chapter 10, we'll get to this next week. He says at the end of chapter 10, here's the summary of what I've said, verse 31. Whether you eat, drink, whatever you do all for the glory of God. So the primary rule, the guardrail, is you must glorify God. Now within that guardrail, he says, verse 32, don't give any offense to Jews or Greeks or to the church of God. So the driving thing is glorify God. But beyond that, as long as you're able to glorify God, then don't offend the Jews, don't offend the non-Jews, and don't offend your fellow believer. And Paul says that's what I do. Verse 33, and then chapter 11, verse 1, you should imitate me, I imitate Christ. So that's the summary that we'll get to. But we're going to work through those 3 chapters in 2 weeks. Now, we spent 3 weeks on half a chapter before, so we're going to have to be very high level. And the point of this will be to take Paul's flow of thought. We're not going to go into any details on any of the verses. Not true. On most of the verses, we won't go into detail. We're just going to try to capture his flow of thought. And it's primarily because, again, the specific issue at hand doesn't even affect us that much, right? Meat sacrificed to idols. Even the example Paul's going to use in all of chapter 9, whether or not he should take money for being a minister, that's not applicable to a lot of us. So the details are less important than sort of his flow of thought and the way of thinking. And so we're gonna go through at a really high level. And the plan is we'll work through 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. Let's see if David, I might have. Oh, now I'm drawing on it. Can y'all see that? Hey, look at that. Is this payback for first hour? That's kind of fun.
You need me to set it up?
Yeah, please. Yeah. I'm sorry. Oh, wait, no, I can click on the picture. Oh, stop. Okay. It wasn't working just a second ago, I didn't think. But I can also draw. Is that?
Yeah, you can.
Okay. So that's actually neat. I mean, I could emphasize or circle something. Okay. All right. So we're going to go through 3 chapters in 2 weeks, and we can do it now. That was hard. 1 Corinthians 11 was hard to figure out. This is mostly easy sledding. It's really, the 3 chapters are mostly easy to understand. The very first couple of verses are difficult, and chapter 9, verse 18 is going to be where we stop today, because that's going to be difficult. But for the most part, we'll work up through 9:18 today. I'll leave you guys to ponder that verse. We'll come back and try to solve it next week, and then finish our way through chapter 10. So let me repeat that plan just so we've got it. So I'll start today. I've already given a little bit of context. I'll give a little more context. We'll cover 1 Corinthians 8 through 9:17. We'll have a question that we're going to get stuck with at 9:18. It'll be homework. And then we'll answer it next week. We'll cover the rest, and we'll have a real practical implication of this. It won't be about what we do for meat sacrifice to idols. It won't be about whether or not we should pay David or Frank or our pastors. It will be about assurance, which will really dovetail nicely with what David has been talking about in 2 Peter. So that's the plan. And let me start with context. Okay, so we're going to do, again, we can't spend long here because we only have 2 weeks and I've already spent some of my time. But let me ask you, who wrote more of the New Testament than anyone else? All right, it's a trick question. It's Luke. Andrew got it. Yes, it's Luke by measure of total volume. So it's a trick question. Luke actually, his books are bigger. So Andre and all of you were right. By measure of book count, Paul vastly outstrips everyone else. But Luke actually wrote more, but that was just kind of for fun. Now let me ask you, what was one of, if not the major thing Paul wrote about? Like, what do you think about when you think of Paul? If you had to summarize one major thing. He talked about a lot. Andrew, try again. Discipleship. Okay, that's not what was in my mind. It's a good one.
Salvation by grace.
That was my thought, right? Is if I at least, and it doesn't, not right or wrong, but I was thinking, you know what? Paul seems to have really helped the church, helped believers, helped progress revelation. The fact that we can be declared innocent, which is what justified means, we can be found innocent in God's courtroom by faith, by grace, through faith. And you'll recall sort of a prevailing thought, or it seems like we can read between the lines, a prevailing thought was that, hey, the Jews, they had a law from God. Like they were given this special gift from God, and they were going to be declared innocent because they had that. And, those Gentiles, they didn't have that. They weren't God's people, and so they were going to be judged because they didn't have the law, right? That was sort of a prevailing maybe sentiment in the circles that Paul ran around in. And Paul said, hey, that's not right on several counts. First of all, yeah, the Jews had a law, but they're not going to be declared innocent because they have it. You're not declared innocent by having a law. What are you declared innocent by? By keeping it, right? Just having it doesn't do you any good. You got to keep it, and the Jews haven't kept it. And second, yeah, the Gentiles are going to be judged, but it's not because they don't have a law. The law's on their conscience. They know what's right and wrong. Yeah, they don't keep it. They're going to be judged too. And oh, by the way, no one is going to be declared innocent by the law. Not a single person. Everyone would be declared guilty. Their mouths would be shut on the basis of the law. But God does declare people innocent as a gift through faith on the basis of Jesus's death. And then they're no longer under the law. They're dead to it. They've died to it. And that, I think, is at least, it's not the only. Paul certainly talked about sanctification, what it means to be a follower of Christ. So discipleship would be another. But certainly one of the things, and certainly relevant for 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, I'll show how in just a second, but God declares people innocent as a gift by grace, which is what we mean by grace. It's a gift through faith. And here's several verses that I could ask you and you would point to. You'd say, hey, Ephesians 2:8, right? Say Romans 3:28. You guys would point to some of these verses, and they show that's what Paul taught. Now, Paul had to defend that as much as declare it, right? Again, that wasn't the prevailing thought of the day. And there were at least two big arguments that he had to respond to in relation to that. One was, hey, that's not what the Old Testament says. This is some new doctrine. Like, that is not, that. I don't know who you are, Paul, but that's not what the last 4,000 years were about. God selected a special people. He gave them the law. They're the chosen nation, and that's all true. But Paul says, really, that is what the Old Testament says, right? Romans 4, that's what happened in Abraham. I mean, he believed God before he was even circumcised. And he says in Galatians, look, the law came 430 years after Abraham. It doesn't invalidate what came before, right? So Paul responds to that critique and says, that is what the Old Testament says. Habakkuk says the righteous live by faith. And so Paul defends that. Now, that's not important for 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, but the next one is. The other thing, at least one other thing that Paul had to respond to was, hey, you're telling me it's a gift, it's by faith, and then we're not bound, we're not under the law when we're saved. That's what you're saying, Paul? Well, then what? That just means we can do whatever we want, right? We can just sin at that point? Is that what you're saying, Paul? And to that, Paul answered at least three things. He said, first, hey, I never said that. I didn't say that. You're putting words in my mouth. I didn't say that you could just sin. You're saying we said that. I never said that. I'm anathema to that idea. I do not believe you can just go on sinning just because we've been given this gift by grace. I never said that. Then he says, in fact, you do have freedom. You are not bound by the law. You have freedom, but you can't use that freedom to please yourself. You have to use that freedom to love others. You have to use that freedom to serve others. And that was another response to Paul to this baseless claim, but this claim. And lastly, he said, I also want to warn you. In fact, I don't teach that at all. If you go off and sin, I don't care what you say. I don't care if you've been baptized and you say that you knew Christ. If you are an immoral or impure person, a covetous person, an idolater, and he gives lists in several different places, if that's you, I don't care what you say, you're not inheriting the kingdom. Yes, the kingdom's by grace. Yes, the kingdom's by faith. But if this list describes you, you are not saved, right? And so, no, you can't just do whatever you want. In fact, if I see somebody out there doing whatever they want, living for themselves, sinning, then that person, no matter what they say, no matter if they've been baptized, if they've given public declaration, they are not saved, right? And those last two especially are going to be really important for 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. They're important for all of Paul's writings, but it's sort of a positive and a negative answer to this idea of freedom that believers have in Christ. Is yes, I teach that we're free. Yes, I teach that we've died to the law. We're no longer bound by it. But on the positive side, you must use that freedom to love and serve, not to please yourself. And then on the negative side, if you go off and use your freedom to live in licentiousness and please yourself, then know that you're not going to inherit what has been promised. Right? That's really important. And those two principles are going to be really important to keep in mind today, during this time, and also for next week, because they are going to underpin what Paul says about meat sacrificed to idols. You might think, how are those two things related to meat sacrificed to idols? Well, they will be, because that was, Paul's going to argue, a freedom they had. But they need to remember that their freedom might be restricted for one of those two reasons. Now, I'm going to go on, and just to make sure, this is the last slide, so I'm not going to draw anymore. I'm even going to put this up. I don't have any more slides. But somebody tell me the two principles, just so I can make sure we're ready to go, because they're going to be foundational. What's the positive principle about our freedom? Andre?
That we were saved by grace.
Okay.
Not under the law.
That's true, but that was what Paul stated, and then he had to defend. Hey, if that's true, then that means you can just do whatever you want. And then Paul said, no. Here's the positive thing about what you need to understand about your freedom.
You're free to not for freedom, not to serve yourself. But
Yes.
to serve and love others.
That's the first. Okay. Somebody else give me the negative, Kathleen.
Oh, I was gonna say we're free to serve God. We now can do it.
And in particular, because that's true, in particular to serve each other. You know, our freedom ought to be used to help each other. What's the negative, Kathleen?
And well, if we're an idolater that's also doing these sins, we are not.
That's right. So the other part is, yeah, you're free, but if you then exercise that freedom by going and being homosexual, effeminate, a hater of God, a hater of parents, or you're consistently evil, idolatrous, whatever that is, then you cannot stake a claim that you know God or that you have come to know him, that you're a follower of him. Those are really important. So I think we're good, but those are going to underpin 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. So I wanted to make sure we had them. Now, we're going to look at 1 Corinthians 8. So go ahead and make sure that you're there. And I'm going to rearrange here for just a second, just to give myself a little more room. And we're going to work through, again, at a very high level, but we're going to work through all the way up to verse 18 of chapter 9. And we'll go really fast, so that may seem discouraging to think that we have that far to go, but we're going to go really fast. We're going to work in chunks. It won't feel that way at first because we want to take a little bit more time on the first 3 verses. So here again, Paul says, now concerning things sacrificed to idols. So he's starting to answer their question. He says, we know we all have knowledge. All of us have knowledge. Knowledge makes arrogant, but love edifies. Now, he doesn't define what kind of knowledge he's talking about yet, because in the first 3 verses, he's just going to lay out his principles. And then you see in verse 4, they'll start to pick up how those principles apply to the question at hand about food sacrificed to idols. But you can see in verse 4, when he does get into it, what he means by knowledge. The knowledge that there's no such thing as an idol in the world, right? Who is Artemis of the Ephesians? It's nothing, right? It's nothing. It's a piece of wood. It's not, there is no such thing. We all know that. So that's the knowledge he means. We'll get to that. But he says, knowledge makes arrogant, but love edifies. Now, does that sound at all to anyone like one of our two principles? The first one, right? What's the first one, Denise?
The first thing is you're free, but not to serve yourself, to love others.
That's right. You're free to build others up, to love others. And here you go. Paul's saying, I'm going to state my principles right up front. My first principle is, yeah, I know we have knowledge. I know knowledge is good, but knowledge can make arrogant. And what we want is to build each other up. We want to love each other. And that's that first principle of Paul. Yeah, we're going to have freedom, but our goal is to build each other up, to love each other. Now, the second principle is going to show up in the next two verses. It's just not going to be clear, but it is the second principle. Now, let me read it. He says, if anyone supposes that he has come to know anything. That's not maybe your translation, but it's the perfect tense. Perfect tense means something has completed. It's finished, and it still has effects into the future. So someone supposes that they have come to know something. They've completed their knowledge in something. And again, in this case, it's that an idol is nothing. If someone supposes that he's come to know anything, he has not yet known as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by him. All right, so it's a contrast, right? There's somebody in the first who thinks he's come to know something. He really hasn't come to know anything at all. He hasn't come to know how he ought. And then there's someone who loves God and has been known by God. So let's take the second one first. It's easier, right? We kind of know what it means to love God. And what does it mean to be known by God? All right, listen to these verses. Amos 3:2, talking to Israel. Israel, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. What does that mean? Does God not know about Assyria?
It's going to give intimate knowledge.
Intimate knowledge is their children. He has a special relationship with them, right? Galatians 4:9. But now that you have come to know God, or rather be known by God, can you now turn back? And he goes on. So what does it mean to be known by God? It really means to have that intimate relationship, to be saved, we would say, in a New Testament sense, right? And so here we say, if anyone loves God, he's known by him. So you have a lover of God in the present tense, someone who loves God actively. It's not a one-time thing. It's an active love of God. He's known by God. Someone who loves God has been saved, right? That seems easy enough. Now we can go back to the contrast and try to make sense of that. But if anyone supposes he has come to know something, he hasn't yet known as he ought to know. What do you think that means? He hasn't yet known as he ought to know.
Well, if he thinks he knows, then he's arrogant, and he really hasn't come to love God to the point where he can love others, and therefore he hasn't been saved.
He hasn't been saved, right? That's right. That's a good, very detailed way to say it. And in short, he hasn't come to know as he ought to know means he has not come to a saving knowledge of God. He doesn't know God. So there's a person that Paul has in mind as he's writing that supposes he's come to know something, like he's resolved. It's a perfect tense. Again, it's done. He knows that it's true, and it is going to affect how he lives. In particular, that knowledge is in verse 4 that an idol's nothing. And so, reading a little bit between the lines here, what Paul is saying is there's someone out there that says, "I know I can eat. I know I can eat food sacrificed to idols. An idol's nothing," right? And that's the end of the story, right? And Paul says you need to be cautious. You might not have come to know God if that's your attitude, right? It doesn't sound like the second principle, but just briefly, let me cheat and go down to verse 12 of chapter 8 and look what he says of these people. What are they doing? They're sinning against Christ. So maybe it doesn't feel like idolatry or homosexuality or adultery or that list that Paul gives otherwise, but he's saying this person is sinning against Christ, ruining a brother for whom Christ died. And if you go on in that, you might not have come to know God, right? And what principle is that? That's the second principle, right? You need to be cautious. You need to be cautious if you think your freedom is for you to enjoy yourself, enjoy your food, for instance, right? You know your freedom is to care for other people, to build and edify other people. And second, if your freedom is leading to that and you are a sinner, like you need to watch out. You can't claim Christ in that state. You need to be careful. So that's the two principles you see that we talked about are throughout Paul's writings, but he has, in a less clear way, admittedly, he's sort of laid out in 8:1-3. Those are the two principles that are going to undergird the next 3 chapters, and you can see Paul has laid them out to begin. And now his argument starts, and you see that in verse 4. In fact, I'm going to take a moment to do a grammar excursus. I feel like we constantly pick on the Sovas. If it's engineering, we call out Anton, and if it's English, we call out Jen. I hope y'all don't mind, but I thought of Jen when I was writing this, and I thought back to middle school English and how much I hated grammar because it just didn't make sense. It was math was so good. Algebra was so fun. It was just like, yeah, you solve for X, and it's not ambiguous at all. And I guess grammar isn't either, but it felt ambiguous. It was like, why is that the subject and why is that the object? And I just couldn't figure it out. I just remember hating English. And I went to seminary, and as part of studying Greek, they made you study English, and I loved it. Like it was just I had matured or something, and it became really important to me. And I think it needs to be important to all of us, I'm sorry to say. And I think for personal Bible study and just understanding and interpretation, you have to understand some basic things. And in particular, I'm particularly passionate, not as passionate as John Piper, if you've ever heard some of his sermons where he talks about the words for and therefore. And I learned a lot from him. But it's really important that you understand the words therefore and for. So I'm just really quick excursus. The word for, again, is just an unusual word for the word because. I know I've said this. I hope many of you are rolling your eyes. I don't care. I'm going to keep saying it. It's just a fancy word, an unusual. It's not even fancy. It's 3 letters for the word because. So when you see the word for, 95% of the time, it's going to give a reason for something or the evidence for something. You can think of it as what's underneath this. I just said something. What's holding that up? Here's a principle or a fact. Now, what's holding that up? What's the reason that that's true? And therefore is just the opposite. Right? Therefore says, hey, I've said something. Now I want to tell what that's holding up. What is going to result from that being true, right? And you can go back and forth. So like you say, I'm going to the kitchen for I'm hungry because I'm hungry, right? Why am I going to the kitchen? What's holding that up? What's explaining that behavior? Why? I'm hungry. Or I could say, I'm going to the hungry. I'm hungry, therefore I'm going to the kitchen, right? You can kind of reverse them and it just makes sense, right? It gives a little bit of math to English. I don't know. It adds a little bit of logic to English, right? And it's just really important that we understand that. And you see in verse 4, Paul says, therefore, so he has stated some principles. What are the 2 principles? Use your freedom to love others, edify others, and hey, if you use your freedom for yourself and you go off sinning, you have not come to know God, right? He stated those principles, right? Here they are. Now he's going to build on top of them. Therefore, okay, here are your principles. Now I'm going to apply those principles to what you asked about. You asked about food sacrificed to idols. So let me talk to you about that. Now we're going to speed up here. So verses 4-6 are very clear. We could go into details and spend much more time, but again, we're staying high level. Paul's going to build on those 2 principles, and he's going to say, yes, I understand, you understand, we all understand, not all, but we understand that an idol is nothing. Yes, I understand that in each of those temples out there, there's nothing. It's just a piece of wood. There's nothing. I get it. I get that nothing's really happening there. I understand that. And so, yeah, in a sense, you can be there. You can eat that food. So, hey, 1 point for eating food, right? 1-0. Eating food is winning right now, right? He says there's only one God. Those aren't really gods. But look at verse 7. However, so while that's true, that is true, idols are nothing. However, I said we all have knowledge, but that's not the whole story. We don't all have knowledge. We're not all at the same place. Here, I'm Paul, a rabbi, studied under Gamaliel, have been thinking about God for years and years the right way, or at least close to the right way. Paul obviously wasn't thinking the right way, but he at least knew God was one, right, and knew that he had a law. But here you have some Gentiles who maybe have no clue. They've just come to understand a bit, and they have been accustomed, remember that word in verse 7? Their habit, their practice is to think of that idol as something really real, right? It's a real thing. And so you take those people in this context, and they don't have that knowledge. So maybe it's not so clear-cut. Let's give a point to the not eating column, right? 1 to 1, I'd say right now. Verse 8, but, so now Paul's going to go to the other side again. But food doesn't commend us to God. It doesn't make us better if we eat or not better if we don't eat. Food is amoral. It's not moral. It's not a good or bad. It's not an ethical thing. Food is not something that makes us morally better by eating or not eating. So it's not a big deal. So let's put another point over here in the eating the food sacrificed to idols. It's winning now. If you're keeping score, Isaiah, I bet is 2 to 1. 2 to 1. But look at him. He's going to go back and forth. Now he's going to make an argument on the other side. But be careful, lest this liberty, lest this freedom of yours be a stumbling block to the weak. Right? Now he's going to give 2 reasons. You see our word for in 10 and 11? Why would it be a stumbling block to the weak? Well, he's already introduced that. They may not have knowledge. And if they don't have knowledge, if they really still think there might be a God behind that, and then they see you who are stronger eating, well, maybe mixing deities isn't that big of a deal. Maybe devotion, single-minded devotion to the one God of Israel, Yahweh, the God who has given his son, the Father of the Lord Jesus Christ, maybe that's not that big of a deal, right? And it could confuse someone who doesn't realize that that's not really anything, right? So they could see you dining and my conscience being weak, right? My conscience isn't strengthened, and I think, so maybe I shouldn't worry about those kind of things. Maybe I shouldn't worry about moral purity or devotion to God because my conscience isn't yet to the point where it's strong to recognize that. And the second reason, verse 11, through your knowledge, yes, you who have knowledge, that other brother who doesn't, he's going to be ruined. That brother for whom Christ died, you're going to ruin him. Right? Now, what principle is Paul expounding here out of the 2? Not the second. Right? The second is, I may not be saved if I'm continuing in evil, right? What was the first one? The first one is, I want to edify and build up my brother, right? And I'm not doing that here. I'm not only am I not building them up, I'm ruining them. I'm going to lead to their demise if I'm not cautious. So let's put another one over here, over here in the points for not eating. It's 2 to 2, right? I mean, yes, you can eat. What is food? Yes, you can eat. An idol's nothing, but hey, not everybody knows that, and you could ruin that person. And then Paul says, and now, Andre, we're going to get to the second, or I was going to ask you, I guess I've given it away. Verse 12, and thus by sinning, if you do that, you're sinning against that brother, and you're sinning against Christ. Is that what you want? You want to continually sin against Christ? No, right? Because the second principle is if you find yourself continually sinning against Christ, you yourself have no reason to expect to inherit the blessings that have been promised to us. So there's the final vote, the tie-breaking vote for not eating food sacrificed to idols. Not because there's an idol as anything, not because food is anything, but because you don't want to hurt your brother and you don't want yourself to be in a position where you're not saved because you're sinning against Christ and against this brother. So Paul concludes, he's stated his 2 principles. He said, therefore, concerning food sacrificed to idols, now he's going to say, therefore, here's my conclusion. Therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again, that I might not cause my brother to stumble. Now, in reality, Paul's done here, right? He's reached his conclusion. They asked about food sacrificed to idols. He's given his answer. He's given his reasons, but he's still going to go on for 2 more chapters. Now, I ask you, there's no for or therefore at the beginning of chapter 9. So we're kind of left to figure out why Paul kept going. And there's rules that you can follow even in those situations. But let me just ask you, why would he keep going? Why do you think he would keep going?
Because it's extremely important.
Okay, and so it's extremely important, and put yourself, let's say that you're that person, and there were, I'm sure, multiple. You're that person, I am free to eat this stuff. There's no reason why I should not eat this. And you feel passionately about that. In fact, such that you had come to a resolute, final decision about it. That's that perfect verb at the beginning, right? What are you going to say to Paul? You're telling me in the same breath, it's fine if I do, but for these other reasons, I can't.
It's not loving your brother.
Yeah, and so that's Paul's argument. But I think Paul recognizes I've made that argument, I've made it clear, I've concluded, but they're not going to be content with that justification. I'm going to have to go further. To Andre's point, this is a big enough deal that, and again, you read commentators and as they talk about chapter 9, it's like, man, what got under Paul's skin about this? Like, I mean, he's really going to start to defend this position that he's taken. This was a big deal to the Corinthians. Kathleen.
And though I've studied this book many, many times with many, many teachers, no one has explained it like you. I'm like, say more. You know what I mean? I'm like, this is the first time I've heard an example of proof that you're not saved, even though you're churched, is that you don't care about your brother.
And
That's not about you.
we'll talk about that in chapter 10. He's going to give that example.
So I can see where people are sitting there saying, what?
Yeah, so he, I'm just going to read my notes here. It seems Paul knows his readers aren't going to be happy with this. Something must be wrong with his two ideas if they result in them not being able to do something they are, in reality, free to do. And Paul isn't convinced that his readers will take the two principles, see how he's applied them to food sacrifice to idols, and be content. He thinks they're going to object, and namely, they're going to object that they shouldn't have to restrict themselves in areas where, in reality, they're free. Now, what Paul's going to do, because he just said it in verse 13, hey, if that's the case, if food causes my brother to stumble, I'm never going to eat meat again. And what Paul's going to do in chapter 9, because he knows his readers are not going to be content, is he's going to point to his example, right? He's going to say, let me tell you about how I restrict my freedoms as an example. Now, we're going to skip verses 1 to 2 for just a second, as I often do when things are hard. And I want to get to the easier stuff and then go back. But verse 3 is clear enough, right? He says, look, you're examining me. I will defend myself. Here's my defense, right? And he's going to give 3 places, 3 areas where he restricts his freedom, thinks he's perfectly capable of doing that he doesn't do. And try to find them for me, starting in verse 4. Yell them out. What are the 3 ways that he restricts himself? He could take a wife. Is there anything wrong with him taking a wife? Chapter 7. I can take a wife. I can take a wife. I don't. And he gave his reasons in chapter 7. I don't want to be divided. I want to be wholehearted. Their times are hard. I don't want to be divided. I want to be wholeheartedly devoted to Christ. He could take a wife. He doesn't. Read verse 4. Verse 4 is just what we've been talking about, right? He can eat or drink what he wants. He doesn't. In fact, he'll say down below that to those still under the law, to the Jews, he acts as if he's under the law. So Paul's probably not eating pork. Can he eat pork? Yeah, he can eat pork, but he's probably not eating pork because he doesn't want to offend the Jews. And what's the third?
Work for money.
Money, right? Money. He is a minister of the gospel. Does he have a right to be supported by those that he's ministered to? Absolutely he does. Absolutely he does. But he doesn't. He and Barnabas do not. Now that last point, he's not going to talk more about marriage. He's eventually going to talk more about food. That's the question at hand. But he's going to spend a lot of time talking about money. And he's going to show how, in his case, why he restricts himself from taking money, because it's going to help him to explain why they ought to do the same for food sacrificed to idols. Now, real quick, before we go on and see what he says about money, we can now sort of understand verses 1 and 2 a little bit better, I think, if we go back. He says, hey, I'm free, right? That makes sense, right? This is what he's arguing. I'm free. That's the main point here. But in particular, why did he start arguing about his apostleship, right? Am I not an apostle? I saw Jesus. Remember, that was a requirement. Remember in Acts 1, like, hey, who's going to be the new apostle? Well, they got to have been there. They got to have seen Jesus when he was, in his earthly ministry. He said, look, you're my work. An apostle is sent out to spread the gospel and start churches and spread the message and be Christ's representative. Look at you. Where'd you come from? You came from me doing that, right? That even if no one else thinks I'm an apostle, you ought to think I'm an apostle, right? You are the evidence that I'm an apostle. Why so much about apostleship here?
Authority.
Maybe. I don't think so. I mean, yes, but what is his point? What is he going to work towards? We just said there were 3 things that he's going to show his freedom that he restricts. food, which is the main topic, marriage, which he's not going to go further into, and money, which he's going to develop at length. What was probably true of an apostle in terms of money? They're supported. That's right. Daniel said it. They're supported, right? An apostle is someone who is commissioned by Christ on behalf of his church to have a specific job, right? Now, when you give somebody a job, you pay them, right? I mean, Willem did all this work this week we intend on paying him, right? I mean, I guess you could do work for a church. Maybe that's a bad example. You could volunteer your time. But when I go to Chick-fil-A, I enjoy it, but I don't go just for the joy of it, right? I go to get paid. And as an apostle, if he's an apostle truly, then he deserves to be paid for his work. He deserves to be free. What other apostles were not paid? It's not clear. But he says, is it just Barnabas and I who can't? So by implication, the other apostles are getting paid for what they do. And Paul's so he's establishing that fact because, again, that's going to be what he focuses on here. And he's going to give seven, count them, arguments for why he ought to be able to take money from them. 7 arguments for why he ought to be able to take money in verses 7 to 14. He's just going to argument after argument. I can get paid for what I do. I ought not have to be a tent maker. Right? He says, and I'm going to go through them quick. Verse 7. Hey, if you're a soldier, if you send a soldier, do you provide for him? Or do you hey, I want you to fight for us, but you're just going to have to kind of pick around and find what you can to eat? No, you equip your soldiers, right? You care for their needs so they can fight. If you tend a garden, do you tend it just to tend, or do you intend, what a pun, do you intend to eat the fruit of it? You eat, right? That makes no sense that someone would tend a garden and not eat of it. If you have a flock, this one hits home with me, right? If you have a flock, do you intend to, well, I guess it doesn't hit that home, we don't milk cars, but do you intend to take some benefit from that flock that you're working for? Absolutely. Who would not? Why would you do it otherwise? He says, look, it's not just human examples, verse 8. It's not just human examples that this is true of. The law says so. And this is one I wish I could spend an entire week on. I don't even understand it. So I don't think I could spend a week on it yet. But he's like, hey, in the law it says, don't muzzle an ox while it's treading grain. Why did God write that? Is he concerned about oxen? No. He was writing that for us so that the plowman can plow in hope. The thresher can thresh in hope. In other words, he's saying the law says itself that the person who serves ought to be paid in their service, right? And in the example of an ox who's doing the work of threshing the grain, they ought to be able to eat some of it, right? He goes on in verse 11 to use 2 examples from a lesser to a greater. You've heard people talk about from a lesser to a greater. If I'm willing to do this for you, I would be willing to do this, that kind of example. And in this case, the lesser to the greater first is physical versus spiritual. So if Paul is sowing spiritual, the greater things among them, and it's taking root, and there's a church, and they have spiritual gifts, and they have life, if he did that, can he not expect some physical remuneration from them? Yeah. I mean, he's given them the greater. Can he expect the lesser? And lastly, verse 12, hey, if others, and apparently the Corinthians were supporting others, right? If others can take this from you, couldn't I? Like, I'm your father in the Lord, as it were. I'm the one who began this work with you. I'm the preeminent apostle, at least in your mind, right? I mean, you are my work in the Lord. And if you're going to pay others, you could certainly pay me, right? And then the last, verse 13, is an analogy that's probably in his mind due to sort of the subject at play, which is, again, temples and meat and temples. And that is in the temple, not a temple, in the temple, what was true of the Levites? They were given portions, right, of the sacrifice. They were for them. They were given an allotment of the sacrifice. And so if all these things are true in all these 7 examples, don't I have a right to get money? And if you're wondering if that's the conclusion, it's very clear in verse 14 as he wraps it up. So also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel get their living from the gospel. It's very clear. He's made a 7-fold case of it. He can take money. He absolutely can take money for what he does. But he says in verse 15, I've not used any of these things. All these rights I have to take money, and I've not. And I'm not writing to do so now. He says that in verse 15, right? Like, don't hear me wrong. I'm telling you why I can, but I haven't, and I don't want to. I'm not asking for you to pay me. I'm just making a point, he's saying. I'm making a point that I have a right to take money, and I don't, right? Why, Paul? That's the obvious question. Why don't you, right? And boy, is he going to explain. I told you the word for is when you start to explain something, he's going to use it 5 times in less than 3 verses. Now, before we look at those, because it's kind of hard to work your way through them, notice in verse, and I skipped right over it, but notice in verse 12 that he's already given a hint as to why. It was in the middle of his explanation of his ability or the rightness of him taking money. So he just did it in passing, but he at least gave a hint as one reason why he doesn't make use of that right. What is it at the end of verse 12?
No hindrance to
He doesn't want to cause a hindrance to the gospel. How could it be a hindrance? Well, what will David teach us in several weeks is one of the things that really drove false teachers. Money, right? Money. And what could be a hindrance to the gospel of Christ? Hey, I know why you're doing that. I know why you're saying those things. You're fleecing us. And there's no question that some false teachers are driven by money. There's no question. And Paul says, I don't want to hinder anyone from believing the gospel, from having a reason to doubt this message that I'm sharing. What does that sound like in terms of a principle? We had 2 principles. I made you memorize them. Does it sound like one of them? It sounds like Paul's saying, hey, I'm free to take money. I can take money. I'm free to do that, but I don't want to hurt someone by them not accepting the message. I don't want to so I'm going to restrict my freedom, something I'm perfectly capable of doing. I'm going to restrict that out of love for that person. And he's going to go into that further. He just said it in passing, but that gives us a hint. But in verse 15, at the very end of it, is when he starts to use the word for 5 different times. And there's no specific explicit questions, so we have to play Jeopardy, right? We have the answer, we have the reason he gives, we just don't know the question that has been asked in Paul's mind, right? So let's kind of fill in the blank. So for the end of 15, for he says, I'm not writing these things because I'm not writing now to get the money, because it would be better for me to die than to have any man make my boast an empty one. So I think the starting question is, hey, Paul, why? Why didn't you take money? Why don't you take money? You're free to do it. And the first reason he says is, I boast in not doing so, and it's deathly important that I don't. That's what he said, right? I'd rather die than have any man make my boast an empty one. So the follow-up question, if I'm a reader, is, hey, why would accepting payment make your boast invalid? Like what would be? And he says in verse 16, because, I'll answer your question, because if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast about. I'm compelled to do so. I have to do it, right? So just preaching the gospel didn't give him grounds for boasting. He was forced to do it. He had no grounds for boasting in that case. And so why is that, Paul? Why did mere preaching not provide you grounds for boasting? He says in 16, because I had to preach, for I'm under compulsion. There's the for. Why do you have to preach? Someone may ask Paul. Well, he says, because bad things are going to happen to me if I don't preach, right? Woe is me if I don't preach the gospel. Well, why would bad things happen to you, Paul, if you don't preach the gospel? Verse 17, because if I do this voluntarily, then I have a reward. That's going to be an important word there. He's going to gain something out of it. It's the word wages. He's going to get paid. If he does this voluntarily, he's going to get paid. But if I'm doing this under compulsion, against my will, it's because I have a stewardship entrusted to me. And remember, it's required of stewards that they be found faithful. If not, then they incur judgment, just like in our previous parable that we studied. That's a lot. Again, it's Paul like rattling off, going deeper and deeper. Remember, we said, therefore, sort of builds on top. For gets you deeper and deeper, sort of grounding why you believe something. He's going really deep, saying, hey, you want to know why I don't take money? It's because preeminent in my mind is not what can I get from it. preeminent in my mind is what's going to happen if I don't do it. I fear, woe is to me, deathly fear if I don't preach the gospel. Right? So Paul has said two things just in passing, I guess. This one's not in passing. The first in passing, I don't take money because I care about other people. I don't want it as a hindrance. And man, I don't even think about what I get from it. I'm afraid if I don't, what's going to happen. Right? And here's where we get to me, the only hard verse in the 3 chapters. So he says, he uses the word therefore. I bet you in many of your translations it's translated then, but it's the word therefore. So he's gonna take what he said and he's gonna take and make a share the result of it, or what does it lead to? What therefore, what then is my reward? I haven't been thinking about a reward. I don't do it for a reward. I do it because I'm afraid. I do it because I fear. I'm under compulsion. I do it because I've been called to this. And what would happen if I'm not faithful? That's all I have to boast of. I do it out of love for the people listening to me. But what is then my reward? You want to know what take it to the food sacrifice to idols. Why are they making such a big deal about it? Why do they want to be able to eat this food sacrifice to idols? I mean, food is good, right? That may be part of it. I mean, you're going to stand out, right? You're going to, like, everybody does it. Everybody looks this way. And now you're telling me I have to be different because that person doesn't understand, right? Well, what's my reward, Paul says? Why am I not taking money? What's my reward? Well, what does he say? What do your versions say that he says? What is my reward? Why do I preach the gospel without charge? What do I get from it? Well, here's what I get. When I preach the gospel, I can offer it without charge, even though I have a right to do it. Now, I ask you to make sense of that to me. And you don't have to now, but maybe afterwards, or as you think about it, to me, that doesn't make sense. Like, it's equivalent in my mind to saying, hey, Matt, why do you work at Chick-fil-A? What do you get out of it? Well, hey, I work at Chick-fil-A. What I get out of working at Chick-fil-A is I work at Chick-fil-A. Like, to me, it doesn't make sense, right? He's saying, hey, the critic is saying, what do you benefit from? What is your reward from preaching the gospel without charge? Well, Paul says, this is my reward, that when I preach the gospel, I offer it without charge, so I don't make use of my full right. So that's what I want to leave you with. Again, it's a 2-part sermon. I hope that you'll be able to listen to the second part as well. But next week, I'm going to share why I think what Paul is saying here and the way out of what otherwise to me seems awfully confusing logic. And then we're going to work the rest of our way through chapter 9 and into chapter 10. We'll finish next week. And we'll finally end with a practical application, which isn't going to be related to food sacrifice to idols or whether we can take money as a minister of the gospel. Again, neither of those are relevant to the majority of us. We know Paul's beginning principles about Christian liberty. We know his conclusion. I told you that at the beginning. It's glorify God, but within those guardrails, don't give offense to Jew, Greek, or another believer. But my understanding of especially 9:18 and what follows will lead to some thoughts about assurance of salvation that will be very practical to us in terms of how we view our standing in God, how we think about assurance. So we'll talk about that next week. For now, I'm going to close this in prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. God, we thank you for your word. We thank you for leaving us a record. Again, there's so much, as we mentioned earlier, we can know in our conscience and through creation, but there's a lot that we can't know and really important things that we can't know on that basis alone. And yet you've given us your word, and we know, Father, that your word is truly the seed that when we hear it, when we understand it, and when we believe it, that itself is the word that enters into us and produces fruit. It bears fruit because of your Holy Spirit, and because you've planned it that way. That's the way that you have planned for us to be sanctified. I think of Jesus saying, sanctify them in your truth. Your word is truth. It's in your truth that we're sanctified. As we get to hear and understand your word, and as we believe it, then that's how we change. And so, Father, we thank you for giving us a record of it. We thank you for allowing us the opportunity to gather, to have time, to have freedom, to have transportation, to have all the things we need to be able to gather together to hear and know your word. But Father, we also know that knowledge in and of itself, by itself, puffs up. Coming to some state of knowledge and feeling complete in that can be a bad thing. And we know we need to combine hearing your word with faith and have our faith work itself out in love. And that's where we ask for your help. We ask for your Holy Spirit specifically to help us to believe and help us to express our faith in works of love and to do it in persevering and without giving up and all the ways David has described to us of those things that will complement our faith and lead to an entrance into the kingdom. Help us to do that, God, even as things get difficult. And we do think about the folks in Haiti and how difficult it must be for them, Father, to have life in the balance and yet still keep their eyes on you. And we just ask that you give them strength to do that. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, we're all dismissed.